Hello, students. I welcome you to this intriguing class with me in government. In this lesson, we'll be looking at the topic non-aligned movements. The objectives is that you should be able to discuss the primary reasons for the establishment of non-aligned movements, also discuss the key principles and objectives of non-aligned movements, and analyze the impact of non-aligned movements on international diplomacy and cooperation. Non-aligned movement can be seen as a non-commitment of a nation to either the West or the East on any international issue. It is the maintenance of neutrality in the face of mounting tension in the world among the superpowers during the era of the Cold War. Non-aligned movement was formed by third world countries. Among the prominent founders are Joseph Tito of Yugoslavia. We also have Jawaharlal Nehru of India and Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt. Non-aligned movement was formed in 1961 in Belgrade, Yugoslavia. The video you are about to watch will teach you many and more things about non-aligned movements.
During the Cold War, the process of decolonization took place faster than ever. More and more countries became relatively free from their former colonizers. We mostly know about how the USSR and the US began to strengthen themselves, becoming the new world superpowers, and thus trying to protect and expand their spheres of influence. However, what we don't know much about are those countries that were reluctant to join any of the two blocs. These were known as the non-aligned states. In this picture, we can observe both blocs. In red, the Eastern Bloc, in blue, the Western Bloc. The rest of the world, in green, represents the non-aligned states. The non-aligned states were those states that rejected alliances and ties with either superpowers, as they had been once colonized by them. This group of countries had decided to take a third path that was not tied to either the American influence or the Soviet influence. Being tied to one of the superpowers would mean that they would be part of Cold War politics, something they wanted to avoid. Not only that, but being tied to them also somewhat meant to be recolonized once again by forming part of their spheres of influence. Those countries that formed the non-aligned movement were viewed as third world countries, not to confuse with the economic meaning of a group of developing countries. First world was the US, Western Europe, and any place that embraced capitalism and a more or less democratic government. The second world was the Soviet Union, its satellites, mostly the Warsaw Pact nations, China, and Cuba. The third world was everyone else. It is necessary to take into consideration the fact that the Cold War did not only revolve around the US and the USSR. Consequently, it should also be considered from the viewpoint of the third world states, as they were clearly connected to the development of the Cold War. One example being the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which was a key factor that led to the collapse of détente. Most of the active members in the non-aligned movement had suffered similar exploitations from European colonial powers, and were willing to fight for their freedom and their independence together, in order to show to the world that they were powerful enough to influence worldwide decisions. They exerted pressure on both superpowers regarding their growing nuclear arsenals, as they feared they would end up in an actual nuclear war. The term non-aligned was first coined by the Indian Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, in a speech in which he settled down the principles for Sino-Indian relations in 1954. For a country to be considered as a non-aligned state, it meant that it could not join in alliances or defense pacts with either one of the superpowers. This would allow countries to try to maintain as much autonomy from them as possible, and to not commit to either side of the Cold War. In addition, most of the non-aligned countries try to exploit the bipolar divide into their own advantage, by ensuring that they left openings to ally with either the US or the USSR. They could also threaten one superpower by saying they would ally with the other one if pressure got to be too much. Consequently, as more countries became decolonized by the mid-1960s, the NAM continued to grow at a greater pace. If they continued to work as a bloc, they would be able to shift the balance of power and gain influence in international decision-making. The main problem encompassed by the NAM was that normally they did not act as a single bloc and thus lacked unity. Despite that weakness, they were able to exert pressure on modern nations on key issues such as the Korean War, the crisis in the Congo, the Suez Crisis, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and the Iran-Iraq War. The origins of the Non-Aligned Movement arose from charismatic and popular leaders that were able to play both sides without getting involved in a particular bloc. A key example that was able to influence other leaders was Marshal Tito, the leader of Yugoslavia. He was dedicated to communism, but he did not pretend to sacrifice his independence at the cost of becoming a USSR satellite. This led to a split with Stalin in 1948, so Americans offered aid to Tito. He accepted this aid, as he thought it would safeguard his country against a possible Soviet invasion, reasoning that Stalin would not get into a war against the US. Tito's unwillingness to have something to do with the USSR changed when Stalin died in 1953, and Khrushchev took control, offering a more flexible approach to Soviet foreign policy. Affiliated with a non-aligned mentality, Tito was able to play both sides when Khrushchev and Malenkov embarked on a dangerous and tiring trip to see Tito, as they were seeking his approval for the crushing of the Hungarian uprising. They had taken the time to visit Tito and not otherwise, thus showing the impact of Tito's involvement in the non-aligned movement. Tito's decision clearly impacted the Cold War, as the USSR's foreign policy approach moved from being focused on invasions to assassination plots instead. Nevertheless, despite Tito's acceptance of American aid, he was unwilling to become too close with the US, as he did not want to introduce capitalism into his country. Successes like this one inspired Jawaharlal Nehru of India and Zhou Enlai of China to resist the bipolar superpower domination. India and China were perfect examples of countries that got rid of former European dominant powers and sought to restore their economic and social independence. For India and Nehru, the NAM was a way of achieving this independence and sovereignty without the need to ally with either one of the superpowers. It would also potentially mean that India would be one of the NAM world leaders, demonstrating that there were alternatives to taking sides during the Cold War. When the Sino-Soviet diplomacy started to decline, the PRC decided to join the NAM. They thought that by joining the NAM, they would spread their Marxist ideology across the world, while avoiding US or Soviet hegemony. The first conference of the NAM was held at Bandung, Indonesia, in April 1955. It was initiated by Tito and was supported by Nehru and Zhou Enlai, who shared common objectives in the Cold War environment. The aim of the conference was to increase the membership of the NAM, as well as to emphasize neutrality in the Cold War. The principle of peaceful resolution of disputes was established as a key principle among member states.
In spite of diversity that exists among its participants, let this conference be a great success.
One of the significant member states in the NAM conference was Egypt, led by General Nasser. Impressed by the NAM aims, he decided to pursue a neutral position in the Cold War and to exploit the attempts made by the USSR and the US to convert the non-aligned states to spheres of influence. Following a non-aligned philosophy of courting the superpowers, Nasser triggered a crisis in the Middle East, known as the Suez Crisis. He persuaded the Americans to fund the Aswan Dam project, and then decided to move towards the USSR by buying arms from Czechoslovakia. He played both sides victoriously. He kept the canal, humiliated the colonial powers, maintained his independence from the US and the USSR, and emerged as a leader of Arab nationalism. This was a clear non-aligned state victory. All of this evidence proved that neither the US or the USSR could play with small states. NAM held a summit meeting in Belgrade in 1961. The main aims were to exert pressure on Khrushchev and Kennedy for a peaceful resolution, especially regarding the Berlin crisis, and warning them about the threats of a nuclear war. This shows the power of the NAM, who now had a voice in the world and even lectured both superpowers regarding global conflicts. However, NAM was not acting as a bloc anymore. By 1962, the Sino-Indian War broke out, and a dispute between the top most important leaders undermined its credibility. This led to a better relationship between India and the USSR, as well as a big blow to the idea of peaceful resolution. A wave of decadence in the NAM increased when Nehru died in 1964 and Nasser in 1970. By the 1970s, the NAM began to collapse as most of the small states became aligned with the USSR, including Cuba, who supposedly supported the NAM. These states chose to align with the Soviets as these promised economic aid and support. The US could not accept that and tried to contain communism worldwide.
Fidel Castro desde Oriente a Batista combatió y a la patria libertó con sus hombres dignamente. ¡Que viva Fidel! ¡Que viva Fidel! ¡Que viva Fidel! ¡Y la bandera cubana!
In 1979, Fidel Castro held the Havana Summit, which considered the possibility of a natural alliance with the USSR. Finally, the NAM in the 1980s started to lose momentum with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. By the late 1980s, the Third World countries ceased to exist, as the political and economical changes brought every single country to different directions. For example, South Asian countries experienced a boom in economic growth, whereas Latin American countries had a stagnating economy. The NAM continued to hold international conferences, but rather than focusing on political issues, they focused on the promotion of solutions for global economic problems. Membership of the NAM grew until the 21st century, with more than 113 member states.